Welcome to another edition of the SprintCarUnlimited.com Deep Dive presented by EnTrust IT Solutions. Joining us on this week's show is author and storyteller Dave Argabright. Before we get to Dave, don't forget to check out EnTrust IT Solutions. EnTrust is a full-service technology company serving small and mid-sized businesses in New York, Pennsylvania, and surrounding areas. The staff at EnTrust IT Solutions takes a personalized approach to technology. See why customers are choosing EnTrust IT Solutions as their technology partner by scheduling a free consultation at www.entrust-msp.com or by calling 717-292-8868. Now here's Dave. Dave, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hey, appreciate it, Jeremy. Great to visit with you.
Always a pleasure. I know we catch up usually at the Kings Royal, Knoxville, and this gives us a chance to talk outside of that area. So I kind of, I was thinking about, I want to get different people on the deep dive, and I like to get some media guys on, but you tell a lot of stories, and I referred to you as a storyteller. We were talking about that off air, but I want to kind of give people kind of a background that they may not know you, or the new fans may not know you. And I think the best place to start is, how did you start writing? Did you just pick it up and go? Did you go to school for it? When did you first get interested in it?
Well, honestly, I was a young guy, just married uh, forever ago, and happened to meet. I was selling life insurance, if you can believe it, and just about to starve to death. And I met the guy who was the sports editor at our local newspaper, and mentioned that I did a little dab of writing in high school in my school newspaper, and he offered me a job as a stringer, which they would send you out on weekends to cover area high school football and basketball games. And at first, it was very intimidating to even think about it. And I thought, man, yeah, I haven't written anything in several years, and I don't know. And he said, well, we pay $15 a story. And that was the hook. And at that time, $15 was a tank of gas, and I could use a tank of gas. And that's really how it started.
It's funny because we have kind of the same background. I was doing dental insurance. I always enjoyed writing, and just kind of picked up and did it for Area Auto Racing News and then moved over to local newspaper, and kind of the same way. Trying, if you can, what's the difference between covering high school sports and sports outside of racing and racing?
Well, for me, I was strictly a reporter, and it's hard to tell a lot of stories. And they would give you maybe 600 words, 400
Yeah.
words to cover a basketball game, and you cover the stats a little bit, get a couple quotes from the coaches, and talk a little bit about the momentum of the game, and that's all you got room for. But it was when I started writing a column, first in the newspaper and then later in Speed Sport News. That's when you kind of have a green light to really tell some stories, explore the human aspect of it and the circumstances. And that was the breakthrough for me. I like doing that so much better than just, I don't mean just, but that fit me a lot better than being a reporter.
Yeah, I remember the days of trying to jam stuff in a certain inch count, which is what they go
Yep.
by at the newspaper. But when did you start doing racing?
Well, I was a race fan ever since I was a little kid. And after a couple years of writing, about football and basketball locally, I was in Anderson, Indiana. It's where I grew up. And I would tell the guys in the newsroom at the newspaper, we've got a great little racetrack here, Anderson Speedway, and we really don't cover it much. And they just didn't know anything about racing. And then we got a new sports editor, and he said, you're exactly right, Dave. We need a weekly racing column, and you're going to write it. And that's really how it opened the door for me there.
How old were you at that point? And then when did you end up at Speed Sport?
I was in my 20s at that stage. That was in the early 80s. And I ended up in Speed Sport not long after that, just writing results for Anderson Speedway. They hired me at the track to do some PR for them, and write their press releases and race results and stuff like that. And I somehow that caught the attention of Chris Economaki, and he began to reach out to me. I've still got some of his letters, in a file somewhere. He would just bang these out on his typewriter, and asked me to do a little bit more coverage here and there. And once I got to know Chris a little bit, things really picked up then.
And when you ended up doing stuff, I believe, for Open Wheel.
Yep. And
Uh,
actually, that came first, Jeremy. I should say that. I'll tell you, I've told this story 100 times, but for me personally, when I saw my first issue of Open Wheel magazine, when it first came out, issue number one, that was a life-changing moment for me. I'm not exaggerating that. I mean, a magazine about sprint cars, if you can imagine in the early 80s when that came out, it just was unheard of and was so exciting, and I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And I, within a few months had sent a couple samples into Dick Berggren, and ask him for feedback, and he kind of helped me get started. And I wasn't very good in the beginning, and it's a craft, as you know. You have to learn, and that's a national platform. But eventually, I got a story published in there, and that helped a lot. Open Wheel gave the writers and photographers a ton of exposure if you could get in there.
you mentioned about it's a craft and you have to work at it. I can't even read my early stuff, just from back
Yeah.
at the newspaper. And it doesn't matter what sport it is. I don't even want to read it. What was there a big influence? Was there a huge influence somewhere along the line that kind of helped you find your voice? That's what good sports editors will tell you now, to find your voice. So when people read a story, they don't even have to see your byline. They don't even have to see your face on it. They know it's you.
Yeah, that is so right, man. It is all about finding your voice. And for me, this is not an exaggeration. I'm not trying to poke fun at myself, but I'm serious. I feel like I wrote for almost 10 years before I started to get it, and found my voice. That seems impossible, but it's true. If I look at that first 10 years, my stuff just wasn't very good, frankly, in my opinion now. And it was 1990 when Rich Vogler was killed. The weekend that he was killed, I was at Eldora, and he was killed at Salem. And I don't know, Jeremy, it was just a cathartic type thing for me. That next day, I sat down and wrote a column about Rich, and that I can pinpoint. That day is when I became a writer. That's when I found my voice, that day in that column.
That's very odd that somebody can. I mean, you can pinpoint it to a year usually, but to an
Absolutely.
an actual incident. Uh, was it just that the emotion came out in your words? Because look, there's a lot of writers out there. What was it that about that column that maybe put you over the top, where you looked at it afterward and said, "Okay, now we can begin"?
Well, for me, I think it was giving myself permission to, instead of, my first stories I wrote from here, and that story I gave myself permission to write from here
Okay.
and what I felt. And as when I didn't go to school to be a writer. I have no formal education at all, and about writing. And it took a long time to feel confident, because you sort of always have in the back of your mind, who are you to be doing this? Who told you you could be a writer? And what makes you think that you're any good at this? And that was hard for me to overcome. I mean, that took a long time. And I guess that day, writing that story about Rich, I gave myself permission to write what I feel, and to put everything I had into it and express myself through those words directly out to the reader. And that was a breakthrough. It really was. That writing was a lot more fun. It took a tragedy to open it up, but writing was a lot more fun from that day forward.
Do you did you read other people? Did you look at I know when I started, I'm like you. I did not go to school for it. I have a finance degree. But I looked at newspapers around the country, columnists, you know, big time reporters. In racing, Jerry Regal was a huge influence on me, if people remember him.
Oh yeah.
Was there anybody you kind of looked at, and did you look for other guys and kind of see their styles and maybe kind of mold your own?
It's a great question. And in the beginning at Open Wheel, it had to be John Sawyer and Joe Scalzo, who also wrote for Circle Track magazine. Those two guys I felt like were the best in the business in racing. And of course Chris, but Chris would tell you he's a reporter. He was not a writer per se. But outside of racing, there was a guy that wrote for Advertising Age magazine. I had a sales career for many years before I went full time into writing, and I read Advertising Age, and they had a columnist for years named James Brady, and he was just superb. I mean, he was just a great writer, and it didn't matter what the topic was that day. What it could be some random thing from that happened to him as a young man years before. He just was captivating, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a guy where you start one of my columns, I wanted the words to get a hold of you and entertain you, and where you just got immersed in it all the way to the finish. And that's what I worked on, trying to be able to accomplish that.
Yeah, they say the first 4 paragraphs, you got to grab somebody. And really,
Yeah.
I know when I write a column, it's usually the first two because the attention spans have diminished.
Absolutely, Jeremy. I'd say you're probably right about the first 4 paragraphs. That's when I started. It was 4 paragraphs. Now it's probably the first 2 sentences.
Yeah.
You better do it in the first 2 sentences or they just move on. And I'm saying that I'm that way too. I'm a lot more jealous and careful about where I spend my time. And if something doesn't look like it's going to be a good read, I skip over it.
Yeah, no, I do. I read a lot of stuff outside of racing, and it's just changed. It's just changed. Now books. I want to spend a
That's
lot of time.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is a way different type of writing. When you're doing reporting or you're writing for even a magazine's different than a newspaper. How long did it take you to, and we'll get to the books in a minute. How long did it take you to switch from that newspaper style writing, which is 2 sentences to a paragraph, maybe 3, to a magazine is way different. It's almost longer form paragraphs. And then for a book, it might be even longer yet.
Yeah, that's a great point. When early in those years in the 80s, when I was on a fairly frequent basis, every few months I'd have something in Open Wheel. And when I did one of those feature stories, I always felt like I could slow down and I could just let it go a little bit and let it go a little longer because I wasn't so worried about, exactly the column inches and how it would fit. Dick Bergen always said, just tell the story, and if it's great, I'll make it fit. I'll make room for it. You just tell the story. Whereas when I did my newspaper column, I knew going in, it was like what I can't remember exactly, but I think it was like 15 column inches. And you got to hit it, or it was whatever it was. It was, it was rigid. You didn't have much flexibility there. So you had to write it differently. But the magazine really helped me learn to write longer form, no doubt about it.
When did you transition to books and why would you do that?
It's really pretty practical reasoning. As I mentioned, I had a sales career for about 18 years and did media right alongside all those years. I started sales about the same time I started writing, and it's still a young guy and finding my way. And it was always nice because I could make a few bucks, on the writing side, but it was never my main earnings, my main income. But in '98, I just kind of was ready, I felt like, to make the transition and go full-time self-employed media guy. And I knew, I don't have a finance degree, but I know a little bit about dollars and cents, and I could figure out pretty quickly, dude, you got to round up a lot of work in a hurry to be able to make this work, because I still had, young kids at home and I was the sole breadwinner. And so I had to take that part pretty seriously. And so I figured up, well, the magazines could be worth, the magazines and short stuff I could make about this much in the course of a year. But if I also did a book, maybe I could make a few bucks there. And that was exactly how it started in early '99. I said, I got to write a book this year. Okay, what am I going to write it about? So I got to thinking, and Brad Doty, I always felt like, was a very compelling story. And I reached out to Brad and said, let's write a book. And his first thought is, he said to me was, man, who is going to read a book about me? And I said, well, a lot of people read about you. You've got a great story. And that's where it took off from there.
How intimidating or daunting was that task? How nerve-wracking was that task to make that leap from having a job, that basically feeds the family, sales job, and then just making that full leap into, I'm a media guy now, a book writer, column writer, short story writer. That's a pretty big leap.
Yeah, and I can't believe I did it. Looking back now, it's almost like, man, what were you thinking? I really, but in fairness, I kind of felt like I had a net, because if I tried the media thing for 6 months, I had a high level of confidence that I could brush up my sales resume and get back into the sales industry, in the corporate world pretty easily. I knew a lot of people. And so I kind of felt, if I had to, I didn't burn the ships completely. I knew I could go back if I had to, and that helped, but it was still, kind of a leap of faith. And I've always been incredibly grateful that it worked, because I just can't imagine my life, these last 25 years, if I was still in the corporate world. And I tell you, I mean, that was a good job and I liked it, but it was nowhere near as satisfying as the media work I've been able to do.
You've written a lot of books. Brad Doty, Jack Hewitt, and we're going to hit on the Doty book in a minute, because you had the Wolfgang book, you had Earl Baltus, you had Jimmy Sills. I'll talk about the one you're working on now in a little bit. But that first book, what was that experience like? Because you never did. It was like you were starting over again.
Yeah, it was a learning experience. And in fairness, to myself, I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I'm just telling it like it is. And
Yeah.
I just kind of felt like, if I could just string together a narrative on Brad's life, in his words, that would be a book. And it's a lot more complex than that. And there's a reason that there's a lot of writers, but only a few authors, because it's just such a daunting thing. The best way I describe it is, it's like you leave on a trip across the desert, and in the first few days, you can look back and see where you've been, so you can see your progress. But once you get in the middle of the desert, you can't see that you're making any progress at all. And so that's when a lot of people give up, because they feel like they'll never get it done. But if you keep pushing and keep digging, you will get to the other side and get it finished. Once I knew that, after that first one, all the rest of them were infinitely easier, because I knew you just keep digging and that book will finish. You will finish it.
How do you pick your topics? Now I'm going to take people through the process. How do you pick your topics? I mean, obviously, Wolfgang, how it ended. Obviously, Brad Doty, how the tragedy, obviously. But say, Jimmy Sill still, guys like that, Jack Hewitt. I mean, obviously interesting guys. But there's a lot of interesting guys. How do you pick your subject?
Well, it's mostly, for me, it was mostly a little bit of blind luck and good timing. And because I wrote Brad's book, and then not very long after that, I was talking to Jack Hewitt, and he said, I've thought about a book. Well, there you go. Off we go. And when I finished with that, I'm looking around to say what's next. And right then, somehow connect with Earl Baltus. And he says, I'm thinking about selling the track and I want to write a book. And it was within a month after I finished Hewitt. So it was just perfect timing. And then I finished that one. And Chris Economaki told me, would you be interested in helping me with the book? Well, and then it just sort of fell into place. But a lot of it, Jeremy, is timing. There's books that I've done that it took me several years to finally get to it where I was ready and they were ready at the same time. And then we could get started on it. But I'm honestly, I say this over and over, I've been incredibly lucky and blessed that stuff happened like it was supposed to. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't change very much at all, even if I could.
So you pick your topic. Now, you just don't write a book and go sell it. Okay, that's
No,
not how it works. Do
no.
you go through a publisher and then you almost have to prove to the publisher that it's going to sell? You have to prove your audience. We had a guy at the newspaper in here in central Pennsylvania. He wanted to do something on a coach, Hershey Bears coach. It's an AHL affiliate to the Washington Capitals. He had to prove to the publisher that people for the Capitals would buy it. So the NHL, you have to jump through all these hoops. How difficult is this process of just even before you sit down to write it, just to get it green lighted to go?
Well, in my case, from the very beginning, when we had the idea to do Brad's book, and there was another topic, I don't even remember what it was, that kind of kicked around as well. Must not have been great because I forgot it. But I talked to a couple publishers and they knew nothing about racing. They just, at that time, now today there are racing publishers. There are people
Right.
public focused on specializing in racing books, but we didn't have that in '99. They didn't exist yet. And other than I think Motor Books Illustrated, I think was
Mm-hmm.
a publisher up in Wisconsin. And I talked to a couple people like that. And to be honest with you, they were you do all the work, you get everything done. They'll print it and give you a really small royalty. And frankly, I knew that in my grand scheme of trying to make a living, that wasn't going to cut it. I couldn't make enough money. And a friend of mine, Ed Watson, who had self-published a lot of books, said, well, you should self-publish it because you take all the risk. You have to pay the printing and all that. But if you're lucky enough to sell the book, you can make enough to make it worthwhile. And once we did that first time, I've never deviated from that. I've never used a publisher. I created my own LLC and then published the books through there.
Wow.
Mainly because I'm kind of hard-headed and I know that works, and so I've not had to change it. And I don't really like being in the book business. I pack and ship books myself, and I don't really like doing that part of it. But that's just what it is. If you want to make it in this business, you've got to take on some stuff that maybe you don't like very well, and that's just how it is.
You're so soft spoken. I never knew you to be stubborn.
Oh yeah, I can be in a gentle way, Jeremy, in a
In a
gentle way.
gentle, in
But
a gentle
yeah, but I guess I'm a creature of habit. The first one with Brad, that book's, the publishers all told me, I think you're gonna sell. The reason they weren't really very interested in, they said they see us selling, a couple thousand books. Well, we sold way more than that. And I
Mhm.
knew we would because I knew Brad Doty's story was very compelling. He was a very popular person, so I had faith, that it would work. And I did learn some lessons along the way, that not everybody is compelling and not everybody is popular. And some books, are way more popular than other books, and you have to be smart to choose your subjects. That a story might be really interesting to you and very special and close to your heart, but unless you can have an appeal to enough people, you just can't justify the expense of publishing a book. I mean, those are the cold hard facts of publishing that nobody really likes that part of it, but that's just the way it is. You take a guy like Doug Wolfgang or Jack Hewitt, and they're immensely popular, and that's what sells books.
I never knew you self-published. I know guys who have done it, and you really are rolling the dice
Yeah,
on.
you are. But on the upside, I like to have control. You
Yep.
hear musicians all the time talk about creative control, and I don't like to give that up. I get to choose what font we use. I get to use what size of book it's going to be. I get to choose what pictures go in it. I get to choose, along with my partner. If I'm writing a book with another guy, he's very much involved with those kind of decisions too. I want him to be happy with what the book looks like. But when you go through a publisher, man, you got somebody that comes and sits on your lap and says, "Oh no, Dave, that's not how we're going to do it. We're going to do it this way." And that doesn't work, but you're powerless to change it because you don't have control. I didn't want that, and I'm glad that I chose the route I chose.
So you pick a topic, you don't have to worry about a publisher. And then now you got to research the subject, which is
Yeah.
whether it's Brad, Doug Wolfgang, Jack Hewitt. How much time do you, and I know this is it's tough to gauge how much time do you think you spend with that individual in that year or over that time frame, just gathering all your information? Or do you kind of write it as you go along? What's your process there?
Well, we do definitely write it as we go along. You know, it's you have several interview sessions, maybe a dozen or more down through the course of many months, and because it opens up, you know, other avenues where, you know, I'm talking with Chris Economaki, and you know, he talks about something that I had no idea that he did in his life, you know, or experienced. Well, now we got to explore that more. That's fascinating, and you know, so that's how you slowly pull it together. It takes me, for me, it takes me at least a year to do a book. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think I could do one in a shorter time frame. Maybe I could if I tried, but it wouldn't be as good of a book because the ideas have to percolate and they have to ferment and season as you go along. And with your subject, they have to think of different ways that they want to say certain things, especially sensitive things, where they have to really put a lot of thought into what they want to go into the book and what they don't want to go into the book. And you can't make a snap decision on that kind of stuff.
As you're writing this, do you show it to them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they proofread as we go along, and that helps because if, you know, in the early stages, if I give them some of the first chapters to read, if they can say, you know, Dave, I don't really like how this is going. I think I sound too harsh, or I think I'm not direct enough. And okay, well, let's talk about how we can change your voice here a little bit and assert more or assert less, and then they grow more comfortable with it too.
Brad's book, The Accident. How tough was it for him to kind of relive that? And have you had that? I mean, Doug Wolfgang, same thing. He had to relive that. And then the lawsuit, which I'm sure was, you know how it is in racing. It's you don't do that, but yet, and people didn't. And I actually learned it years ago from your book that he did it to put a safety, a safety vehicle and safety personnel out on the road with the Outlaws. That's what he wanted. And you kind of brought that to light. Was it difficult for some of your subjects to relive things like that?
Yeah, and it is very sensitive. And one thing I've learned, and I'm a people person. I think that started with the sales career all those years, and I've learned to read people as they're telling me things, and I can gauge, you know, how emotional somebody really feels about something. I pay attention. And the upside to this, you talk about Brad's accident and Jack Hewitt when he talked about losing his father,
Mm-hmm.
and Doug Wolfgang, you know, with his accident, Earl Baltus when he talked about selling the track and what that would mean to him and how difficult that was. Um, Jimmy Sills when he talked about Brad's accident, making him step away from the sport for a while and how painful of a period that was. You can tell that often when we relive those human experiences, it's a cathartic experience. I mean, you heal as you relive some of those things. You have to kind of get it out of your
Yep.
system, so to speak. And that's been a great, good part about all of this. I've always felt like that it was a good experience for them, not just because they made a few bucks on selling a book, but it really was a life experience to share this with the world, even really sensitive things that, you know, I had things that each of them said, I didn't really think I'd want to talk about, but this is okay. You know, I feel okay about talking about it like this. And that's a good thing. And I think that's what makes for a good read.
I agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons I do this particular show. Philip Dietz, we talked about Jason Johnson and he got choked up. And I think in some weird way, I think it is therapeutic. I do think getting it out there, it's almost like you have more people in the boat with you at that point. So I think those things are important. And obviously you want to make money with the book, you want to tell a story, but I think it also serves that purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the two things that I really want to achieve, and it's the greatest compliment when people tell me this, and it feels great. And one is when somebody talks about Jimmy Sill's book or Doug Wolfgang's book, and then they say, man, when I was reading that, I could hear Wolfgang
Yeah,
talking. I could hear his voice, and that's my job. When that's happening, I'm doing my job well, I feel. But the other part is when they say, I had people that called me or emailed me and said, I mean, these are prominent industry people I'm talking about who were angry at Doug Wolfgang for 10 to 15 years, didn't speak to him. And they reached out to me with an email and said, hey, I read your book on Wolfgang, and I was so moved on when he told his side of the story that I saw things in a whole different way. And I just called him on the phone to talk to him. And then their email to me, they just said, I want you to know that you're doing important things to help people here. And that's a great thing for any writer to hear. Because, Jeremy, all of us, any of us that write, we want our work to matter. We want it to
sure.
make a difference. And when you hear things like that, it kind of validates all those long hours with your butt in the chair, writing that book.
It's funny. I think of that when I go on my rants about things that are wrong. I don't do it to pick, and I'm harsher than you. I don't always have that gentle to
Well,
touch
you're
me.
from the East, Jeremy. That's how it is.
Yeah, that's how. But the point of all those things is to hopefully affect change. Yeah, because if you don't evolve, and I could go into hours about that, we all know how racing can be.
Yes.
But like I said, the Doug Wolfgang book, I learned a ton. I was a big fan of his as a kid through the 80s. And that was one of my childhood heroes. And you hit that one, you knocked that one out of the park. Is there, when you sit down and like in a day, okay, you're not punching the time clock at 8, 9 o'clock, leaving at 4 or 5. You look like you have a nice office there. I need to clean mine up. But do you sit down and, okay, I'm going to dedicate 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock today on this? Because I find in my business, it is the worst thing. You have a TV there, you have all these distractions. It's easy to get caught up in those other distractions. How do you follow through with everything and stay on a schedule? And what's your schedule like?
Well, I'm not a 9 to 5 guy. I don't have to be rigid about my time frame. And I've learned through the years, I've become pretty disciplined because I've kind of got a big target out there that I want to hit as far as
Mhm.
getting a book finished by a certain date. And I know, if it's going to happen, I got to stay with it and move it a few inches a day. You can't move it a few feet in a day. So you got to stay with it. But it's a matter of discipline. For me, it is. And it depends, when I'm early in the process, I'm a little more lax about a little bit in the morning, a little bit in the afternoon. But when I get into book mode, I'm probably not a lot of fun to be around because I'm just absorbed into the narrative and I'm absorbed into the words. And, I've had times where my kids would tell you that, they got up to get ready for school and there I am in my office and they'd poke their head in and say, Dad, you're starting early today. No, no, it's just I'm still cranking from last night, because you just get caught up in it and you're absorbed. But I'm a lot better now. I don't do those all-nighters much. And I've learned if I do enough work during the day, I don't have to.
Yeah, it's something that I struggle with even now. And I've been writing for God since 1997, 98. I struggle with it now. I still struggle with it. So I might be calling you off air to ask for some tips because it's very difficult. And now I have the minutia of, okay, we got races this weekend and this and that. I'm not writing a book. It's a little different, but still, I know I need to be more disciplined. So I really respect your discipline and being able to pound out a book like that.
Well, I appreciate that, but I'll tell you the people that I admire, Jeremy, to be honest with you, and I know a number of guys in racing that they had a full-time job. I mean, they had a nine to
Mhm.
five job, and then they would go home in the evening and work on a book, and some great books came out of that. I don't know how they did that because I don't know if I could. I had the luxury from the get-go that I could devote all of my energies into that book, and I didn't have to go to work at 8 in the morning. And I don't know how guys do that, and I admire them very much.
Was there a book that you maybe hold closer to your heart than others? I mean, I know you enjoyed all of them, obviously, and it's not disparaging to the subject to say, at least I don't think. Is there a book that is your favorite?
Well, I say that that's almost like asking somebody which one of their kids is their
I know.
favorite, you know.
I have to
But
ask though.
honestly, they were all a different experience, and the best part of every one of them was that I made a greater friendship with that person when it was done, and kept that friendship to afterwards, and that means everything to me. But I have to tell you, the Wolfgang book was really, really special because it was a particular time in my life where I really feel like I was in a good zone as a writer. The creative juices were flowing pretty well. And Doug is such an amazing,
Yes.
compelling character that I picked that book up the other day, just looking for something that on my current project. And, I got to be honest here. I mean, I started paging through and thought, this is pretty damn good, and yeah, I'd
Yeah.
forgotten. It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
But that's because of Doug. I mean, the way he speaks and the way he tells a story, and he's so compelling that, yeah, honestly, if I had, all I could do there is just screw that book up, because he was such a natural at telling his story that all I had to do was just let him talk and just help him a little bit here and there. And that's why it's a good book. It's Wolfie. And I give him all the credit just for who he is and what a person he is, what a character he is.
There's got to be a pretty big amount of pressure on you too, because if you don't get it right, not only do you have the subject mad at you, the people won't buy. I mean, there's a lot of layers. If I write a bad column tomorrow, I can write one the next day. A book,
Yeah.
it lives. I mean, yes, what I write it lives, but a book is a lot different. So is there, how much pressure is it to get it right, to go back and look and just dot your I's and cross your T's, not once, but like 40 times over?
Yeah, I mean, every book I've ever done, and I say this without any pride, believe me, even though through the course of the drafts and the revisions and all that, you read that book, I'm estimating 40 to 50 times. That sounds ridiculous, but that's really how it is as you revise and move on to the second draft and the third draft, and then proofreading and proofreading. But every time, damn it, there's a one or two at least typos in any book
Yeah.
that I've ever done. And I don't know how I could work any harder at not making those mistakes, but I do my best, and I do have some help with editing sometimes to help me smoke those out. But I can live with a typo here and there. But what I would really hate is if somebody felt that I produced a book where I really missed the mark with that person. In other words, when they read it about Doug Wolfgang and felt like, well, that wasn't Wolfie at all. Now
Mhm.
that would hurt. I would really hate that. Luckily, I've never experienced that. I mean, nobody's ever told me they felt with any of my books that I was, missed the mark. But I take that very seriously, and I try to. It's not about me, and I try to check my ego at the door and just listen carefully, and then read my work carefully and say, look, is that really Jack Hewitt? Is this really representing who he is and what he's all about? Because that's what it's about. It's not about me.
And the fact that you self-publish, you don't have the benefit of a bunch of editors,
Yep,
which is
that's right.
both good and bad.
It
But
cuts both ways. Yeah.
did you ever write a book where you came away liking the person more than before you started?
Yeah, probably. Chris Economaki, I don't know if you ever had much opportunity to get to know Chris, but
Talked to him
he
very little bit, but
yeah,
that's
he could be a gruff, cranky dude. He was just that classic cranky old man sometimes. And at first, I wasn't sure how that part would be, but you spend that much time with somebody, you really do start to see their humanity come out, and he really did have a caring heart, and he held a lot of things very dearly that took a while to kind of smoke those out. And he was that old World War II generation guy where he didn't want to share that with the world. If you read his book, it's very informative and entertaining, but there's not a lot of Chris opening his heart and sharing his feelings like, say, Doug Wolfgang, for example. And that's a lot because of that generation that Chris was in, the World War II guys. You didn't talk about stuff like that. You didn't talk about vulnerabilities and things that hurt your feelings, and you just didn't open up. And so that was hard to get him to do much of that.
Your new project, Steve Kinser.
Yeah.
We knew this was coming at some point. I mean,
well, I sure hoped it was. Yeah.
Steve was so. Is there a release date for it officially, or are you still, where are you at in this process?
Well, we're heavily involved in writing it right now, every day. We're working on it. Our target date is sometime after the first of the year. My goal is to have everything wrapped up and hand to the printer in December. I think I can hit that, because if we do that, we'll have books late January and February. Everybody said, why couldn't you have it by Christmas? And Jeremy, we would have had to hurry. And I'm just not going to hurry. You touched on it a minute ago. A guy like Steve or Wolfie or Sills or anybody like that type of a book, your autobiography, you just get one swing at it. I mean, very few people have known. Willie Nelson comes to mind, where he wrote a couple different autobiographies, and they're both great, but not very many people can pull that off. You get one swing at it usually, and that's it. So I don't want to hurry. I don't want to try to hit some artificial deadline for commercial reasons to sell them at Christmas. We'll sell them next Christmas. I want to take my time and make this the very, very best book it can be.
I'm assuming you went to him.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's no way Steve's going to anybody to.
25 years ago, I went to him. So
how did you wear him down?
Like I said a minute ago, it's really more about timing and where a person feels they are in their life and how open they are to sharing these kind of things. And when Brad Doty and I did his book, we asked Steve to write the foreword. This was in '99.
Okay. Yep.
So, and Steve was kind enough to do that. And we published the book, I think, November of '99. One of the first things I did was called Steve and said, hey, I want to bring you a signed book from Brad and I. And I want to take you to lunch and thank you for doing the foreword. So we did. And we went to lunch, and I said immediately, we sat down at the little restaurant there in Bloomington, and I said, okay, when are we going to start on your book? Now, this is November of '99, okay? And he's looking at me and he says, why would I ever want to write a book? So we spent the lunch talking about it, and it was a great discussion. And he's kind of warmed up a little, but that was a long time ago, and we got done eating and went to the car, and he said, I'll tell you what, he says, someday I'll write a book and I'll write it with you. And I said, okay, fair enough. I won't pester you. I won't bug you about it. And I didn't. Every great once in a while, every few years, we'd sort of mention, yeah, I'm not ready yet. Okay. Well, then finally, about a year and a half ago, we connected, and I said, hey, why not now? And he says, let's do it. So, because the one thing I told him, I said, Steve, I can promise you one thing, that we will have a lot of fun writing this book. And it has been. I go down and I sit at his kitchen table, and how many people get to go sit at Steve Kinser's kitchen table and have him talk about his career and his life, and we laugh, and it's just it's fun. I'm such a privileged person, I'm telling you.
Have you ever been turned down where you never got a chance?
Yeah, very much. I don't know if you remember Tommy Ibo, the drag racer, TV Tommy Ibo back in the day, the childhood movie star. And I flew out to California, or I was out there covering a race for television, and Tommy and I had dinner, and he was looking to write a book, and I would have loved to have written it. He's a fascinating character, but he wanted somebody that knew more about drag racing, which was fair enough, and he ended up writing the book with Tom Cotter, the PR guy, and it's a great book, so I didn't get hired on that one, but that's okay. I had plenty of other stuff to do, and everything worked out fine. I do think sometimes, Jeremy, about the books that I wish I had written, but that window kind of opened and closed. I think a book about the Weld family,
Mhm.
Kenny Weld and Greg Weld. If you knew those two guys, they were incredibly complex and fascinating and compelling characters. Great racers, just fantastic personalities, troubled and all of that.
Yep, yep.
That would have been a hell of a book. But I didn't know how to write a book yet when I got to know Kenny and Greg, and he passed away, and then Greg not long after passed away, and the windows closed then. I mean, I could still write the book, but it wouldn't
It
be
wouldn't be as
a
good.
shadow of what it would be if they were doing the talking.
I'm waiting for the Sammy Swindell long form.
No, he's got a book, Bones
Yeah.
and Bob Mays wrote. It's a good
Yep.
book.
Yep.
And so that's pretty long. So I don't know, Jeremy. I don't know if he'll do a longer one.
Do one with you. Yeah.
Well, I told Steve, and we laughed about this, and Sammy published his book, and I told Steve, I said, "Well, dude, Sammy's got his book out now, so I can tell you, you're going to have the last word. So it's
that,
all good."
and I'm sure he liked that.
He laughed. It was good.
No, I've read that book. I didn't know if that was something you broached. I mean, I'm sure at some point Donnie Schatz, someone's going to want to write a book about Donnie Schatz.
That
I
would be
mean,
a good one. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you ever worry? I mean, let's face it, times are changing. We all hear it, newspapers, so on and so forth. Do you ever worry that people will stop reading books?
Oh, no question about it. Sure. I worry on a couple different levels. And I don't mean to sound pious here in any way, but I'm a reader, and I'm a World War II history nerd. And I know, for an average guy, I know a lot about World War II. I got that knowledge through books. I mean,
Yep.
you can't learn that stuff reading 400 words at a time. You can't do it. It's too in depth, it's too complex to really understand a subject. You got to go deeper, and a book is how you do that. And I worry, frankly, about our society a little bit, particularly in terms of retaining and processing and analyzing our history. You learn from history. I mean, I read somewhere that history is not a study of the past, it's an explanation of the present. And
Correct.
it really is. And if you don't have books, I don't know how you're fully going to know what really happened before. So yeah, I do worry about that. And but so far, I've been heartened a little bit. Everybody's very enthusiastic about Steve's book, and so I think enough people still read books that they're still commercially viable. And my concern is younger people.
Mhm.
I think there are a lot of younger people that they couldn't write a book about or read a book about their own mother, because I don't think they would understand the process of sitting still that long, turning pages, and really learning about something. So I do worry about that, definitely.
It's funny you mentioned World War II. I was just at Barnes and Noble today and bought a World War II book.
There you go. I'm proud of you,
I'm
Jeremy.
I read it from the other end because I try and study the psychology behind how Hitler and Nazi Party rose to power. It's actually a book I bought today. It's Hitler's American Gamble, and it's how it pulled us into the war. It's so I'm anxious to read it, but no, I agree with you, and I do worry about the younger generation. Now, the fortunate thing is racing's an older generation, and we're
Yeah,
usually about 10 to 15 years behind
yeah,
society on stuff.
yeah.
So hopefully you and I are still good for a long time.
Well,
Now you're
part,
doing,
part, if I can
go ahead.
interject one more thing on that, Jeremy, part of what worries me when we talk about history is that, like, Steve is just a great example here. Okay, 20 World of Outlaws championships, 690 World of Outlaws wins. Those are in the records. Those are in the books. But his presence in the sport was just enormous for
Mhm.
25, 30 years. But if you're a 17, 18-year-old kid, you don't know that. So somebody comes along and they string together 3 or 4 championships and win a bunch of races, and you think this guy's the greatest dude that ever drove a sprint car ever. And you genuinely don't know what somebody did before you. And that part bothers me, I think, more than anything, because I think you're not as well informed if you don't know the history a little bit.
I'm going to agree with you. I know the big debate, with Larson and shots and everything, that the numbers that are being put up. I've seen them all. And I've seen those guys. So, and I do think people forget. I know somebody who is a photographer who started in about 2011, 2012, and he'll talk to me about racing. And he doesn't equate Steve as we know Steve. And I tell him, I said, you go back and watch some video. That guy,
Yeah.
there's a determination to win a race. And I don't know if it's like Jordan playing with the Bulls compared to LeBron.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great example. If you just arrived and watched the NBA, who's Michael Jordan? You
Yeah.
know, and
Yeah.
so that's where I think we've changed a little bit. When I first started reading Open Wheel magazine, sprint car racers took a lot of pride, fans, people took a lot of pride in knowing our history. We prided ourselves on knowing Tommy Hintershitz. He happened long before I came along, but I knew about Tommy Hintershitz. I felt an obligation that I needed to know about Tommy Hintershitz if I really wanted to be a serious sprint car person. You've got to know the past. And so that's changed a little bit. Our culture now is a lot more wired for the here and now.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is. But I don't think we'll ever completely lose the need to understand history.
Yeah. I know I think I saw Lynn Paxton race like 2 or 3 times. And I know when I started writing, I felt it was necessary to go back and learn more about Lynn Paxton if I was going to cover Central Pennsylvania.
Yep.
So you're right, but some of the younger generation, it's not bagging on the younger generation. They don't have time. Society moves faster now. You're moving around. It's a TikTok society. It's just different. So, but I would encourage anybody, if know your history, because it repeats itself.
Yep. One thing I've thought about along that line is, somehow transitioning the books, the text, particularly some of my older books, earlier books, in a different form, into a digital form, either an ebook,
Mm-hmm.
either an audiobook, a podcast. Maybe, that 23-year-old racer who's riding hours up and down the road, he's not going to pick up a book and read it, but hey, he'll listen. If you took, Doug Wolfgang's book and put it in a podcast where each chapter was an episode of the podcast, and you could get through the book by listening to it that way, maybe then they would, grab onto that a little bit. But it's very time consuming to create an audio book like that, and I just never have gotten around to going back and doing that.
I think that would be very beneficial for people. I think that would be a great idea. Now you're in Steve Kinser mode now,
Absolutely.
but are you already thinking about your next project?
Yeah, a little bit, the back of my mind. They in author circles, they caution you about, don't think about the sexy new book,
Right.
because your book is in the grind mode and it's not sexy and fun. It's just work right now. And if you're not careful, you start thinking about that next book that's this attractive, sexy idea. And then you start getting tempted to say, well, let me set this one aside and
Yeah.
go tackle that new exciting book. And you can't do that. You just can't. So I don't do anything active to pursue that. But in the back of my mind, a couple things I'll just tell you. I grew up in Anderson, Indiana, and we have a race there, the Little 500. It's a pavement race, and they've raced almost 75, or actually have raced 75 years now, and it's just a fabulous race and lots of fun. And growing up there, it's always been special to me. And one of my goals in life is I want to do a book on the Little 500 someday. So maybe that'll be next. I don't know. But I also think a book about 1978 and doing the research for Steve's book has really opened my eyes that there's a lot I didn't know that was going on at that time. And truly, Jeremy, that year is the most important year in sprint car history. There's no question in my mind. The launch of the World of Outlaws forever changed the course of the sport. Fascinating bunch of characters, Ted Johnson, different things. And that would be a good read, I think.
I'd line up to buy that one.
Yeah,
because I agree with you.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah,
So.
that's good. No, I agree with you, especially since, we had USA, we had NST, and now we have High Limit. And I think, I don't have a dog in the fight when it comes to the World of Outlaws High Limit thing, but I don't think people realize how hard it is to start a series. And a look at 1978, Ted Johnson and what he put together. Granted, sometimes it was hodgepodge and out of the back of a Lincoln, or caddy, but regardless, what was done really set the table for what we have today.
Yeah, probably if Ted were to be honest, if he was still around and could talk to us, I'll bet you, Jeremy, that first 2 years, I'll bet there were a dozen times where he thought, I'm done.
Yeah.
I don't know where to go from here. I'm out of money. It looks like this may be the end, but somehow, got to the next race and it kept going. And just like, if you open a new restaurant or something, studies will tell you, man, that first year or two are just everything,
I think it's that way for any business, especially
Yeah.
now. So there's always, I know I'm 7, 8 years into this and I still look at some things and go, got to change that. Wish I would have done that. And it's just always a work in progress. So no, I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. So I we'll see how that whole deal plays out, but I've learned enough that, it'll work out like it's supposed to. I really believe that.
Well, I'm pushing for the 1978 book over the Little 500 book.
Okay. Well, I know where your heart is. You're a dirt guy.
Oh, I'm a 410 dirt guy.
Yeah.
So Dave, I could talk to you for hours. I appreciate you coming on the show. I think we've learned a lot about the process, the books you've done. And, for me, the process is amazing. Again, I didn't know that you were self-published. That's really interesting. And I look forward to the Steve Kinser book.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's a guy I watched through my youth. And, I think it also reminds people of what he's done. And again, I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jeremy. Always great to talk to you.
All right. We'll catch you at a track soon.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you. That's going to wrap up this edition of the SprintCarLimited.com deep dive presented by EnTrust IT Solutions. Thank you to Dave Argabright for joining us on the show. A lot of good stuff there, a lot of insight about some of his books. Also, don't forget to click the subscribe button on our YouTube channel and check out our daily exclusive content at www.sprintcarlimited.com. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Deep Dive.